Introduce you to Sarah and Raymond, our speakers today. Sarah Roadhorst is the CEO and co-founder of Onwards HR, and she has over 20 years of experience launching SAS HR platforms at startup and Fortune 500 companies. Sarah is a sought-after thought leader and speaker on layoffs and DE&I in the workplace and women in technology. Raymond Lee is the founder and president of Career Minds, a global outplacement company. And Raymond has over 20 years of HR experience and outplacement experience as well. He's an active member of the SHRM Speakers Bureau and has recently published a book titled Clocking Out, a Stress-Free Guide to Career Transitions. Sounds like a great read, Raymond. I look forward to that. So I'm going to turn it over to Sarah now to kick us off, and I'll be back at the end today for the Q&A session. Sarah?
Thank you so much, Cynthia, for having us today. And thank you everyone for joining us. We're really excited about this conversation. And today we're going to learn about how to prepare and plan for a layoff that complies with employment laws, effective communication strategies to ensure a positive exit experience, and recommendations on how to help your organization recover after a layoff. Now, this topic has been in the headlines daily, multiple times a day. And Raymond, I think we have one in particular we wanted to talk a little bit about.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. And hello, everyone. Greetings from Philadelphia. It's great to be here and sharing what we believe is an incredibly important topic. Like Sarah said, ton of headlines currently in the news related to layoffs and how companies are handling layoffs. Earlier this week, Sarah and I had the pleasure of sitting down with a writer from CNN Business to interview us on how companies should handle layoffs in this interesting time. And it's interesting because this article, which we're going to share in the materials afterwards, was published yesterday, and it's really a great kind of segue into what we're going to be talking about today in terms of best practices around compliance, compassion, and really how you should be thinking about your employees as it relates to a layoff. And so with that said, I want to sort of give you a visual here that I think sets the kind of the framework for our discussion today. You know, obviously layoffs are incredibly stressful for everyone involved, whether you're having to lay off 5 people or 5,000 people. I think the thing that we all have to sort of think about is what's the risk factor as you're thinking about a layoff. And you know, this bullseye really kind of represents the larger the layoff, the greater your exposure to lawsuits, to social media posts, to getting in the media, and even some internal, you know, issues with culture. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that today. But happy to have you all here. And with that, Sarah, do you want to get into sort of how companies should manage this process?
Yes, I'd be happy to. You know, first, if you're on this call, you probably understand how complex layoffs are to manage. They're difficult, and in large part because they are so often managed manually. They're difficult in addition because they're resource intensive, right? The planning for a layoff starts 6 weeks before any employee is ever notified, most often. It involves HRBPs, HR operations, employee relations has to feed information into the program. And then there's also the employment counsel, right? You need to have that legal review and finance to help pay out severance. And it's almost like a dance because everyone has to be in the know and in sync to manage through the process. It's also very time consuming, as we already mentioned. It takes upwards of 6 weeks. And when you're talking about employee exits and a layoff, a lot of times you're having that because of financial reasons. And every single day that process takes, the longer it takes, the company is going to be paying payroll and benefits. And then there's high legal costs as well. So a lot of times, especially what we're seeing with the tech industry, who has just grown, you have a lot of folks in HR that are amazing at recruiting and scaling organizations, but they just haven't really been faced with the challenges that come with a layoff. And so, because they may not be that comfortable with adverse impact and WARN and some of these compliance elements, they turn to outside counsel, and that can get really costly. Now, when it is managed manually, mistakes, they unfortunately are common and risky. And I think we're seeing a lot of the headlines right now really kind of relate to this. I mean, there's errors that can happen as part of the documentation process. There's severance pay errors. I think there's an example of Better.com accidentally paid severance out to employees prior to the notification. Then you have to worry about bias. All of these different mistakes can really impact the company. The impacts can be through severance overpayment. If you have a mistake in the agreement, you're going to invalidate the waiver of rights. And then every company, the fear of a lawsuit, whether that's a wrongful termination lawsuit, a retaliation lawsuit, lawsuit related to WARN violations, it's a big concern. Now, here's just an example of some of those headlines that we've heard. And I don't know, Raymond, have you ever made a $10 million mistake? I haven't lately, not that I'm aware of.
Yeah, I wouldn't say not that I'm aware of.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's one of those things that when you're talking about separation mistakes, they're just not an admin fix. These separation mistakes have big impacts. And we're not talking, hundreds of dollars here and there. We're talking millions of dollars. One example here is the EEOC charged the NASA lab with systemic age discrimination against older workers. And that lab had to pay a $10 million lawsuit or settlement. Another example here on the top right corner is a $2.7 million mistake. This example was when an HR representative ended up doing the severance package great. The catch was when they put the total amount of severance into the agreement, they put weekly instead of total. So that employees' severance due to them equated to $2.7 million. And this is just a couple of examples in the headlines, but anytime, negative press, separation mistakes ends up in the headlines, it becomes a public relations nightmare that can have a devastating impact on the company's corporate brand and reputation. In fact, some 84% of employees would consider a pay cut in exchange to work for a company with a better reputation. I mean, I don't know, Raymond, what your thoughts are on that.
Well, so first of all, I think you shared first some really good examples in terms of how the compliance piece can really impact your company's bottom line. But when I think about the compassion component of it, I was just listening this morning about how people were recently notified either via text, or I think I heard someone was giving like in the hospital about to have labor. And I'd be interested, from the group here around like what are some of the experiences you've had as it relates to sort of misnotifying people or what you're hearing is mishandling notifications. If you do share something in the chat, I would say let's keep the companies off and be respectful. But I think the point here is that the compliance piece that really impacts your bottom line as it relates to the financial component of severance, but then also the human element, in terms of, how individuals' lives are being disrupted. And so, we're certainly going to cover some best practices that we've put together here that has come from a lot of feedback that we've heard from some of our clients and HR practitioners. And so it really just begins with the why. And so as you're thinking about the planning process, one of the components that is just incredibly important is the why. Why are we having this layoff in the first place? And I think that it starts at the top. It starts with your CEO, your president, the business unit leader, where that impact is happening. And I think there needs to be alignment around all of the leadership team, key stakeholders, and understanding what's the business case behind the reason why we're having the layoff in the first place. It could be related to, merger or acquisition. It could be divesting a business. It could be loss of a big customer. There's a number of reasons that would impact your unique business situation. And so, really having alignment around that is really important. So from there, Sarah, it now jumps into how do we select? How do we pick the people who are going to be impacted?
Well, it all boils down to being fair, right? I think it's so important for employees. I think a lot of times they'll understand that layoffs have to happen. Sometimes they are unavoidable. And when they do happen, though, there needs to be an understanding that employees were selected in a very fair and consistent manner. And so one of the things that we think is so important, and especially because separations are so often managed manually, I think there's some thought that it becomes a subjective decision, that there isn't this tracking of who's this or of that, and that bias sometimes can leak into the decision process. But when you use data to be able to drive that employee selection, and that you're somewhat transparent on what selection was used as part of the process, it can be received that much better. There was actually an article by the Harvard Business Review, and it was some time ago, but the elements are still very relevant. It's entitled, "It's So Hard to Be Fair." And they compared two companies. Company A actually offered a really rich severance package, but they didn't fully communicate the reason behind the layoffs and the selection process. Whereas a company B, they were very transparent in that communication elements. And their severance package wasn't as rich, but it ultimately came down to that second company had less lawsuits as a result of that layoff, because of that transparency and because people really felt like it was a fair process. And so it is critically important to be objective as part of the employee selection process. Some common selection criteria include tenure. So last in, first out, it's very straightforward. People can understand it. Work elimination is another one that is commonly used. A lot of times there may be layoffs because of a loss of a really significant contract. Now, there's a couple of other areas that get a little bit more fuzzy, is when you do employee selections based on performance or skills or experience. In those instances, it's critically important to make sure that you have the appropriate documentation and that there has been that effort put forth to ensure that people are compared on equal ground. Other important information as part of any kind of a layoff situation is the sensitive information around leaves, investigations, employee relations. So if in the event that an employee may have complained about their manager, like during the process, the exit, it's important for legal and HR to understand that if this person's been selected and they've complained about their manager, that information is brought forth and transparent during that process. I think, you talked about leaves, the example that you just mentioned, where there were two parents, both working for the same company, that were impacted. That's one where, you have two family members. There was another where a woman was on maternity leave, I think actually giving birth at the time that she was impacted. These are really sensitive situations, and at the end of the day, we're talking about people. So that's important information for organizations to have. Now, the reason it gets so important, in addition to just it being fair and understood by those employees, is because there are government agency regulating to make sure to hold organizations accountable for treating people equally and fairly as part of the exit process. In particular, the EEOC is there to help prevent discrimination. One of the elements that we recommend organizations go through is checking for adverse impact. So in the event that they did have a selection criteria that ultimately did show some bias towards a protected population, running adverse impact analysis will identify if there has been any significant, any protected populations that have been significantly impacted as part of that exit. And this helps organizations prevent discrimination before employees are notified so that they can make adjustments before it's too late, basically. And then the other organization or agency that governs separations is the Department of Labor. And that's getting into your leaves requirements, FLMA requirements, making sure, and workers' comp, just making sure that if someone is on leave, that they have been treated equally and fairly as part of that process. Now, anytime there is an exit, an involuntary exit, it's a difficult thing for organization or for employees to really take on. And given your background, Raymond, do you have some recommendations on how companies can help ease that transition?
I do, Sarah. And as you were just saying that, the thought that just popped in my mind was that companies spend a lot of energy with onboarding their employees.
Yeah.
I think about rolling out the red carpet when employees are starting and onboarding and making sure that they really have a great start to their start to the company. And this is tied to offboarding. And I think that as you're considering your employees and the impact of them leaving the company, I would encourage you to visualize this rolling out the red carpet as they're leaving. Their remembrance of the company leaving is going to have a much more lasting impact than what it was like when they started. And so, when you're thinking about severance benefits, it really is around the peace of mind that you're giving them that provides them with the runway that they need to transition into whatever it is they're going to be transitioning into. And so, their severance pay, their health insurance provides that peace of mind. Providing outplacement assistance, EAP, really sends that message that you're really helping them with finding that next opportunity. And so severance benefits are incredibly important, which really leads to the next component, which is the impact to the culture. And we kind of led with our discussion today about how sort of mishandling the notifications and the layoffs can put your company in the public media, on social media. We certainly want to avoid that, but the other significant impacts that layoffs have, particularly if they're not handled properly, is how the work that you do impacts your company's culture. And so we're going to kind of dig into a little bit here around the notification process and sort of the, from the planning through the notification to the exit. And so, there's a lot of focus around how employees are being notified. And I have to tell you, when you think about 10 years ago, when we were in the recession of 2008 and 2009, there's probably a playbook that existed in your file cabinet where, you were conducting layoffs, everyone was coming into the office. Well, obviously times have changed. And this next, sort of layout is, kind of the notification process that we're establishing a new playbook. Our workforces today are much more distributed. Significant populations of our workforce are either working virtually, they're hybrid. So, some of them are working virtually, some come into the office, and then you have others who are in the office. And so the planning for notifications today are so much more complex than they were a decade ago. And how we think about delivering the message to, this employee population is really critical in terms of logistics. and just ensuring that they have a graceful exit and really are treated with dignity and respect. And there is a lot of compliance related to this. And Sarah, I'm going to pass it back to you so you can share, sort of the precursor on the compliance check, and then we're going to come back.
That sounds good. I actually, before we go there, there's a post in here that I thought was really interesting. I just want to share with you, Raymond, and see your thoughts on it. And they said, the issues they've seen as part of layoffs are result of a lack of communication down to the manager, and then having to field rumors. Just curious your thoughts a little bit on that challenge.
Yeah, so this goes back to the message in terms of alignment of the business case. I think most of you probably have employee town halls that are meeting on a monthly basis, where whoever the leader is, president, CEO, they're sharing kind of the state of the business as it relates to how things are going. If there's a layoff, it to some degree it shouldn't come as a surprise based on economic factors. It's really important that you're communicating with your managers and leaders so that they share what they know versus what they don't know. Communication's key, and we're going to certainly spend some time around training your managers to make sure that they're not, sharing misinformation, because that obviously impacts the culture in a negative way.
Yeah, no, that's so good. Yeah, so to jump in a little bit onto the compliance side of things, again, back to the Department of Labor. Here we're talking about WARN. WARN is the Workers Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act. And it has made headlines recently with a couple of the layoffs that we've heard. And just kind of do a little background on what WARN is. So WARN is a federal regulation, and it requires, it applies to organizations with over 100 or more employees. And it looks at if there are 50 or more employees that are impacted from a single location. If there are, it is quote unquote considered a mass layoff. Now, there are other nuances in it, but that's kind of the general rule there. Now, what if it does apply? And just to clarify, when they're looking at 60 or 50 or more employees in a single location, they're looking backwards and forwards 90 days. It's a look back and a look forward period. Now, if WARN does apply, those organizations are required to give 60 days advance notice to those employees, or do the equivalent in payroll and benefits, So it's important before you move out, before you start any notification process, that you're checking for WARN to determine whether this applies. And if it does, to make sure you follow the appropriate procedures by sending out the WARN notices. Now, there are also state governed mini WARNs. New York, for example, has a 90-day advance notice period. New Jersey is another one that in April, they're going live with their mini WARN, and it's going to look a lot like New York. But it's important for organizations to realize there's a federal one that applies across every state in the US. And then in specific states, there are some more strict requirements that organizations are going to need to comply with.
Hey, Sarah, I had to ask, just something that popped in my mind is around virtual. We're getting ready to share a little bit of best practices on virtual. How are virtual employees who work from home accounted in that 50 or more employees from a single location? It seems like that could get tricky.
It's very tricky, and it's one of the challenges that a lot of organizations have with determining whether or not WARN applies. I think it's best to kind of almost share through an example. One of our customers, we calculated WARN for them, and what happens with remote workers is that a lot of times there's two different ways of applying it, but a lot of times they'll roll up to their manager's location. So if they're remote, and let's say you're my manager, Raymond, and you're up in Philadelphia, so my location would actually be Philadelphia. Mm-hmm. And we would both be counted against the Philadelphia office location. Now, what happened during COVID, we did a lot of WARN and analytics at that point. There were entire teams that were entirely remote. And so we were assisting some organizations through the layoff process and in determining whether or not WARN applied. They didn't realize it, but they were triggering WARN at their corporate headquarters because there were 5 different layers that all were remote. And so they all rolled up to the headquarters. So it does get a little messy in the whole virtual world of determining whether or not WARN applies. And so we do recommend either, consulting with an attorney or using a, analytics tool to determine that whether or not WARN applies. Now, I think that it comes into what do you recommend, Raymond, around some communications around large reductions in force?
Yeah, this is from a hybrid and virtual standpoint. I'm seeing this is really useful where either the day before your large event or in some cases, maybe the morning of, but typically it's 24 hours before, where the CEO or business leader will send out a communication ahead of time, letting employees know that there are going to be some changes. What I found in the past, decades ago, is that everyone's on site, and so everyone's in the office. And I know companies have taken an approach where they would go and either tap someone or have someone go into a conference room. But when you have a hybrid workforce where employees are remote, working from home, other employees are in the office, I think this communication from your leader really sets the expectation that changes are coming. You can really create the narrative here in terms of what employees should expect. One of the challenges that we're seeing time and time again is that many of these virtual meetings are held in group sessions, and what's happening is it's hard to kind of keep track of who's showing up, who's not showing up. And so we do recommend in the cases where you can to do the personal one-on-one meeting versus handling large group announcements. I'll share some examples of why that's the case. And then it also lets the manager send out a calendar invite. So, if the leader sets the expectation that changes are coming, everyone's going to get a meeting notice, and you're going to get a notice from your manager, it allows you and your managers to schedule those virtual calls with employees who are both impacted or going to be retained. So yeah, go ahead.
I just had a question for you, Raymond. I know that there is a lot of communications going out recently and some news of organizations notifying their employees through email. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's hard. I think it's heartbreaking. Like I can't imagine receiving a notification via email or text message. I think personally, people, you're impacting their jobs. And I think people need to hear it personally. I think a Zoom call is obviously very appropriate to meet face to face and hear the news of why you're severing my employment. I think the employees in all situations are due that opportunity. And so I would, and that's from a culture standpoint, it's just the right thing to do.
Yeah, I agree.
So shifting gears and really kind of talking about the virtual notification meeting, I'd like to focus more on the hybrid situation. I've heard cases recently where employees who are hybrid, so they're spending a few days in the office, they're working virtually. Companies are inviting them in to have that face-to-face meeting. And in some cases, employees are driving 45 minutes to an hour to come in and have their meeting and then have to turn around and drive home. And so, from a time perspective, I would say if you have a remote or hybrid employee, do the notification over Zoom, really save them the gas money to drive into the office if at all possible. I do feel like when you do one-on-one meetings, it allows you to also have control over who's being notified. I heard of a recent situation where there was a group meeting that was done virtually with a team, and for some reason, one of the team members didn't join the meeting, and then later that day, the entire team's emails were turned off, their badges were turned off. Well, everyone was notified, which was great, but the one employee who didn't get the notification goes to log into their email or Slack, and all of a sudden, they don't have access. And so the
That's right.
one-on-one meeting really gives you that control. In terms of the platform, I would say any virtual platform, whether you have a company platform like Teams or Zoom or Google Meet, I think using any platform is appropriate. I would say just be thoughtful about, if you're setting up a RIF meeting, I wouldn't send an invite to the person and title it RIF meeting. Those are like the really minor details that if you're
Yeah.
doing this for the first time,
That's
you
a
could
good
get tripped.
recommendation. I think that's a good one.
I mean, it's a no-brainer, but you know what? Sometimes,
But some people will do it, right?
and the
Someone's
other
going to do
thing,
it.
like everyone has access to my calendar too. I've come to realize that. So when I go to the gym, they know I'm going to the gym. So you have to be really
You have,
discreet
yeah.
about,
But
about
in the
that.
moment, sometimes you're not thinking about it, right?
Exactly. And well, and you're the severance package guru. So, talk to us a little bit about virtual severance packages and how we should think about that.
Yeah, I think as important as it is to verbally communicate the notification in the right way, what to say, what not to say, it's hard. People are just taking this information in, and they just, a lot of times they aren't expecting it. Even if they see the signs, they just, can't believe it's really happening. And so for them, it's important to also deliver the paper package, right? And in the traditional world, in the office world, you have a copy of that separation agreement or the separation notice or terms that are there that you can share with that employee. But in a virtual setting, you don't have that luxury. One of the things that we recommend and what we do for our customers is automatically generate those separation packages. So at the point of notification, as they're running through that notification checklist and communicating with that employee, they're able to email that package to the employee. That way the employee has it. So after that meeting, when they're just absorbing what they just learned, they have something tangible that they can reflect upon, look at, and then come back with questions. And one of the things, I don't know what your thoughts are on the timing, like during the week, is there a good day for a notification versus a bad day? I have some thoughts on it, but I'm curious what your thoughts are.
I will tell you, so everyone says, oh, do it on Friday, it's the end of the week, but that's the worst day to do it because you don't want the employee to leave and go home for the weekend. And now we're thinking about, like what they can do. Like they're just upset about it.
Right.
I would say, middle of the week is probably the best time, but I would stay away from like Friday as your notification day.
Yeah, I totally agree. What we find is so many employees have questions.
Mhm,
And if you have the weekend, there's nobody there to answer any of your questions. So they just
mhm.
stew over these concerns, and they just want to talk to someone, but there's nobody to talk to. And then that just lets things fester. And then they kind of look elsewhere to communicate. And that's when you get a lot more on social media and a lot of other concerns that companies don't necessarily want.
Mhm.
But yes, I totally agree. Wednesday is actually our recommended day because it gives you 2 days to prepare. You communicate on Wednesday, and then there's 2 days for that employee to come back and ask questions. So no, very interesting.
Yeah. And so practice, practice, practice. We're going to get into just a few points here. A lot of this you've seen before, so I'm going to kind of quickly go through it, but really connected to virtual meetings versus in-person meetings. And this is actually the notification meeting. So definitely recommend the manager deliver the decision, the reason for the layoff, having HR there present. Always get questions of, should everyone be on video? My own personal opinion is that the manager should be on. HR may or may not want to be on, and I think it's appropriate not to make the employee have their video on, right? Like they're obviously getting bad news and it can be emotional. And so, they may not want their camera on, and I think it's okay for that. But in terms of the decision, the manager communicates that, and it really is a meeting that typically is 10 to 15 minutes, and it really boils down to maybe how many questions that the individual employee has, but giving them time to respond to the message, listening, and then transitioning to HR, where you're gonna, not read the severance agreement, the 5-page waiver and agreement word by word, but just really hitting the highlights, when it's due back, what's the decision point, what's the transition going to look like. The last point I'll make here, Sarah, is that I think it's appropriate if you have a lot of notifications that the manager ducks out. If you're going to be going through the severance, whether they're in an office or on a virtual call, they deliver the news, they provide that response after the employee, and then once they transition to the point where they're ready to hear about next steps, then they're in good hands with HR. And I think that the manager can duck out of the meeting if they need to run.
No, that's good. There was a question that came in, or kind of more of a comment, and I just wanted to read it to you, get your thoughts on it, because it's very relevant to what we're seeing now. But when the notification is a big list, like some that we've seen, it is unrealistic to call each person individually. Group notifications might be the only option. So for organizations that really just have that as their option, do you have recommendations?
I think it's very appropriate that you can have a small group, so if the whole team is being displaced, or, let's say it's a customer service department or a sales team, and it's a team of, let's say, 10 people, I think it's okay, to pull the team together and say, and maybe just go right to the next slide, because this is, this is kind of an example, and I'll tie it to the message. This is just an example message that's tied to that business case that we talked about earlier. So you're connecting the impact to some, economic reason. So in this case, it's a healthcare company, lower patient volumes, increased costs. There had to be decisions made to reduce staff. And if you have a group of, 10 people, you could say you are among those affected. So today, this will be your last day of work. There's actually some benefits to that, because, while they're not hearing it personally, one-on-one, having it in a group, they're like, wow, this isn't a performance issue, right? Because we're now eliminating the entire department. I think there's something to be said for that. The only watch out that I would say is, we're going to talk about checklists in a little bit, Sarah, right, around, making sure that, no one's falling through the cracks. And so the only exposure is when you do that group meeting. It's really important that HR accounts for who was present. And that goes back to whoever's in your command center where they're tracking, that big spreadsheet, and literally checking off who was notified, because that list ultimately is going to go to IT, it's going to go to security. And so you want to make sure that every employee who's being notified is accounted for.
No, that's so good.
And I would say the next thing is, just don't underestimate the listening and responding with empathy component. Again, you're delivering some tough news, and in some cases, people will expect it's coming. They may have already had the opportunity to, sort of get in their mindset prepared. So, their response could be, yep, I saw it coming, let's move on. But then in some cases, you may get some response about, concerns that they have, or, things that, they're going to respond to. So I think it's important to give them that opportunity, and then be able to be prepared for any employee reactions that come out. There's, 6 of them here, and we're going to share this with you. I won't go into it in a ton of detail, but, we all know that, there will be some reactions, and oftentimes it's not what you expected from the different employees. But, there's always some underlying feeling and a motivation which really triggers these emotions. And then suggestions that you could provide to your manager. So if someone's angry or hostile, your manager should stay calm. You know, they shouldn't argue or become defensive. In some cases, if they're sad or they're crying, giving them the opportunity and allowing them the time to grieve is important, showing compassion. And so just recognizing these is going to be important. And then last but not least, our checklist, which again, if you're in that situation where you're having a large event, so if you're a company of, let's say, a few thousand employees and you're impacting 5% of your workforce, having what we call command center, where there's that one person who's sort of managing either the spreadsheet or in your system that's tracking everyone to make sure everyone's accounted for, they've been notified before you go deactivate access to. And today in this virtual world, you have Slack, you have email, you have, probably 20 software applications that people have access to that you have to account for. So from a virtual standpoint, there's a big lift for IT. And I know that there's always that rush to want to get the list to IT so that employees who are impacted don't have access to software. But it's really important that you're running through your checklist to ensure that everyone who's being impacted actually has that meeting. Sarah, what am I missing here? I know that this is exhausting in terms of this checklist, and I know that you're a big proponent of checklist.
This is something near and dear to my heart, in a sense that this is an opportunity for improvement for organizations, is a lot around the workflow and making sure the order of operations is happening as it should, and there's the appropriate approvals and workflow, and everyone's in sync. So when you talk about that command center, I'm guessing traditionally, most people on this call are like, okay, I have an Excel spreadsheet that everybody's updating and notifying that way, or maybe it's a smart sheet or something along those lines. But we've found that this ends up being a big challenge for organizations, is making sure everyone is on the same page, because you've got last paycheck rules, you've got all of these compliance elements. And so you need to be really tight on this from a compliance standpoint. And as you mentioned, the worst thing that could happen, all of the headlines over and over and over again are about someone that doesn't, their badge isn't working anymore, right? They got a paycheck, a paid severance, but nobody told them they were terminated. I mean, these are things that are real, that happen. And an organization doesn't want that to happen. It's just the process broke. And so, yes, this is something that we care quite a bit about, is just making sure that everything happens when it should happen, that everything gets approved by those it should be approved. And it's so important to have all that information centrally stored, so that it can be accessible in real time. We had a situation where a company we've talked to reached out to us because they had an exit, right, a layoff, and they offered a great benefit package. Again, organizations are doing right with their benefit package. Well, what happened was they, through the offboarding checklist or some command center failure that they were using, they forgot about a group of employees that never got paid out. And so it's one of those things that these things happen, right? These mistakes happen just because they just don't have the right tools in place. So getting the offboarding checklist right is really, really, really important. Now, the other area that we feel kind of strongly about is just making sure the severance package as a whole doesn't have any mistakes and complies. But it's hard. Again, it's hard for organizations to get it all right because there are so many things that they need to take into consideration. So one of the things is, again, states, like to do state things. They like to have their own regulations, their own way of doing things. And so there are oftentimes in many states, not all, unique language that has to be part of their severance package, their separation agreements, depending on where that employee resides. And not all organizations kind of do that well. In fact, not all law firms do that well. A lot of times we'll talk to companies who are like, well, my law firm gave me these separation agreements. We worked with one customer who did just that and gave us all of their separation agreements to configure within our platform. And we said, that's great. We'd love to configure your agreements, but just want to let you know that there is California language in every single one of these agreements for New Jersey, for Georgia. Do you think maybe you want to refine this? And they did. They ultimately went back to their attorneys, brought it to their attention. They ended up coming back with another set of separation agreements that we ultimately configured for them. And then they had no mistakes as part of that process. The other thing is, which is governed by the DOL, are separation notices. Now, these notices are often to inform the employee about unemployment insurance that may be offered to them. But every state, again, likes to do it their own way. And they have their own flyer and they have their own contacts that employees can reach out to. So again, it's important for organizations when they're preparing these separation packages to make sure that they are providing their employees with these state mandated separation notices. And then just to, I kind of call this compliance check number 2, is around OPA, OBIPA. Everybody likes to call it a little bit different. We call it OBIPA, but it's basically a mandated disclosure that goes at the end of your severance package. And this is an area that really kind of will trip up a lot of organizations because they need to disclose the decisional unit and everyone's roles and age that has been impacted. And not only those that have been impacted, but also those that are considered. And this is incredibly important for anyone who's over the age of 40. And this is a challenge for organizations because it's a lot of data. And last minute, people get transferred to a new part within the organization. And those all need to be treated in a unique way. So, this is something that organizations need to be mindful of, and especially in very large reductions, because there can be, when the business reason is the same, you actually need to disclose everyone who's been impacted in previous events as part of it. And so sometimes these disclosures get quite long.
And Cynthia, I saw you pop in. We're gonna finish up here. So we covered everything that is related to planning, and we're going to just touch on briefly and start to wrap up here with Q&A. After the layoff, it's incredibly impactful to your employees. And what I'd like to share is a couple of tips here on the next slide related to how to communicate with your employee after. So this is your surviving workforce, as they say. Consider sending out a pulse survey to your remaining employees, particularly those who are working remote, asking questions about, the process and how they're feeling, get feedback. The idea here is that you're going to want to try to uncover, are there any issues with people, particularly those who are working from home that aren't coming into the office. And in the next slide, the transition process, we have to recognize this is change, right? This is very impactful, and every one of your employees after the layoff is going to transition differently. And so giving them, that opportunity to say goodbye, and really shifting to a point where they can look forward and really re-engage with their work, with their new team. And then sort of wrapping up here, allowing individuals to help one another. And I think this is really critical for leaders to step in. Leadership is always evaluated when things are tough. And so staying in contact with your employees, especially the ones who are working from home and virtually, getting feedback of, how they're feeling, encourage questions. When you don't have the right answers or know the answers, coaching your managers to come back to HR or their leaders and being incredibly transparent. And so what I want to do is we're going to share a little bit of who we are. Career Minds, our company is a outplacement provider, and I put some information in the chat here related to what we do. And so there's two sort of handouts, if you will. We have one that's a guide to handling a layoff with some virtual layoff best practices. So if you want more information around, sort of the planning of the layoff. And then second, if you're interested in outplacement or you're looking for an outplacement provider for your employees, there's also information that you can download there as well. Sarah? I think you're on mute.
I was. Just a little bit about Onwards HR. So we are an offboarding platform that is designed for HR, legal, and finance teams to ensure consistent, compliant, and supportive employee exits. We are data-driven. We interface with your HCM platform. We aggregate data across other systems. And then we guide HR through selecting employees, calculating severance, assessing compliance with warrant and adverse impact. We automatically generate your separation packages and those OBIPA disclosures. And then we track notifications, deliveries, and signatures as part of our offboarding checklists. And I'll put some information in the chat as well. If you want to kind of look at a case study of one of our customers, and be happy to answer any questions you have. So at this point, I'll just turn it back over to you, Cynthia.
Good deal. What a fantastic presentation. I thank you both for this wonderful information you provided today. We do have just a couple of questions before we have to leave. And one of them is, what time frame do you recommend letting employees know that they're going to lose their positions? Does it matter whether they're high level or whether they're hourly employees? Is everyone treated the same?
I go ahead, Sarah.
Well, I think it depends on the situation. I mean, obviously, there's going back to understanding why there's an action happening can drive a lot of that. One of the things, like if it's part of an acquisition, that there are going to be more global company-wide announcements well in advance than ahead of communicating individually with each of those employees. If in the event that it is more timely, that there is something to be said of the notification being close to the corporate-wide notification being close to the termination, but then there's a payout of the benefits to ease that transition. So there's a lot of different scenarios that drive different approaches to that situation.
I was just going to add to that. I think, if you're a part of a collective bargaining agreement with hourly employees, there could be requirements as part of that in terms of notification and how that would work. But agree with everything you shared, Sarah.
Wonderful. Here's a good question for you. Do you recommend some type of severance for everyone? Or do you just think that, people who haven't been there very long, they don't deserve anything? Or what's your philosophy on that?
I certainly believe everyone deserves some severance. I mean, they've taken a chance on the company, and the company needs to do right by those employees. And we've seen a lot of the organizations we've worked with, they've actually that are going through these big significant events, they've actually made their policies more rich, where they've increased that minimum number of weeks just to make sure that they're helping these organizations, or not the organizations, helping the employees ease their transition.
Wonderful. And then the question of stay bonuses. I'm sure that you would recommend that, especially for your managerial and executive level people. But is there a magic number? Is it 2 weeks that you recommend, 1 month? Is it based on what the company feels? Do you make recommendations on stay bonuses?
Yeah, I would just my 2 cents on that. I'm assuming this is after the layoff for employees who are, really are feeling unsettled about the news, and maybe working on their resume. I think I would say depending on the impact they have on the business and maybe their tenure with the company, there's a number of ways that you can determine the stay bonus, but I think it's an effective way to retain your employees who are feeling like maybe there's another wave coming. And so I would say that's a really good strategy to put in place. And so Sarah, did you have any comments
No,
on that?
I agree with everything you just said.
Yeah.
And then we have a couple of questions. Mary Evans asks, can the location be based on where the employee's position is assigned? Sometimes the manager is in one location, but the employee may have a region and would have worked in a different office, and that is where the position would be assigned.
I'm guessing if
That's
just
a good question, Mary.
context, I think that might be related to Warren. If I understand the question. And there, when you do for the remote assignment, there is very tight requirements around that. You can't pick and choose. You really do need to go to the physical location of your manager or the nearest location for that employee. And you can't pick and choose. Everybody needs to be treated equally in that. And that's something that does catch a few HR people when they're looking at Warren.
Yeah. And let's see, there was another question. Ask about stay bonuses. Oh, do you guys have a contact screen with your contact information? I know
There we
you.
go. Sorry. Yes, I should have
There we
moved
go.
that. There we
go.
go. We have a contact screen and then we
Oh,
will
good.
also, yes, you can contact us.
Yeah. And I was going to say, as I was thinking, Sarah, and I know it's 2:00 and people have to drop. I mean, I just want to put it out there. If anyone has follow-up questions that maybe we couldn't get to,
Yeah.
we're here. If you want to reach out to us through LinkedIn or through email,
Very good.
happy to take this conversation offline if you have some really unique situations. So really appreciate the opportunity to be part of the discussion today.
And I
Yes.
want to say thank you to both of you. And Sarah, thank you for your articles and your insightful presentations. This has been great. Raymond, thank you. Nice to meet you.
Yes, nice
Hope
to meet
see
you as
again
well.
soon, and hopefully we'll have another webinar from you guys soon. So
Yes,
great.
Stay tuned.
Stay tuned.
remember everyone that I will be sending you the credits and Sarah will be sending you the PowerPoint and the survey. So thanks everyone for joining us, and we hope to see you next Thursday for our next webinar.
Yes, and one thing to note, everybody, stay on. Part of Zoom will give you a survey as part of the process. So stay on and complete that survey. But thank you, Cynthia, so much for having us. Thank you so much, Raymond, and everybody have a great day.
Yes.